Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Well enough? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Education Policy Seminar. My name is Preston McGuirk, a first-year doctoral student in the Education Policy program here at the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. This talk is part of the Education Policy Seminar series sponsored by the Bankert Foundation. Each semester, EdPolicyWorks hosts a number of talks that are free and are open to the public. For more information on EdPolicyWorks or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Jason Grissom. Jason is an associate professor of public policy and education at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education and Human Development. He studies the governance of K-12 education, including both its leadership and management, as well as political dimensions. He is particularly interested in identifying school and district leader impacts on teacher and student outcomes. He has ongoing research projects examining principal effectiveness, the measurement and evaluation of principal job performance, and how principals use evaluation and other teacher effectiveness data to make hiring, assignment, support, and retention decisions in their schools. Jason holds a master's degree in education and a PhD in political economics from Stanford University. I feel most fortunate for the opportunity to introduce Jason today, as he and his colleagues at Vanderbilt supported my growth as a student there and eventually my transition to doctoral study here at UVA. For that, as well as the influence of Jason's meaningful work, I feel particularly thankful. Today, Dr. Grissom will be talking for approximately 1 hour and will leave 15 to 30 minutes for discussion and your questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 2 p.m. can be addressed via email, as other meetings will be beginning at this time. Thank you for attending this education policy seminar, and please join us for the next talk when we'll host Dr. Dylan Conger from George Washington University. Please welcome today's speaker, Dr. Jason Grissom.
Thank you, Preston. I appreciate that. I'm Jason Grissom from Vanderbilt, and I'll talk until apparently 1:59, and you should ask questions as we go if you have things, especially like points of clarification, things that you want to follow up on. There'll probably also be time at the end as well. So what I'm going to be talking about is some new work that I have on licensure examinations for principals. So I do a lot of work on principal effectiveness, school leader effectiveness, trying to measure it, trying to figure out what it is when we see it, and try to do that in a systematic way. I do some work on principal evaluation and so forth, and this work is gonna touch on different aspects of that. But this is specifically about licensure exams that we use for people going into school administration, and I'll explain what that means here in just a second. So the motivation here is pretty straightforward. We know that school principals matter a lot for school performance, for all different aspects of school performance. So we've linked effective leaders to a long list of school outcomes, and that I've got just a partial list up on the slides here, but positive learning climate, instructional coherence, teacher and parent satisfaction, et cetera, including student outcomes, student achievement, other kinds of outcomes. So the point is, we know that leadership effectiveness matters a lot for schools, it matters a lot for teachers, and it matters a lot for kids. And because it matters so much, policymakers care about it. Okay, so the state policymakers, district policymakers, have a lot of interest in ensuring a high quality leader workforce. And so they don't have that many tools, though, for trying to ensure that leadership quality is well, let's say good. We might say adequate, but for trying to achieve that goal of having a high quality leadership workforce in schools. And so licensure systems are one way that a state might try to ensure at least a minimum level of educator quality. So licensure systems vary a bit from state to state. But most of them have a set of common components. So And essentially in every state, you have to complete a state-approved administrator preparation program. That's usually university-based. There are a number of alternative programs, but most are university-based. You usually have to earn some kind of degree in educational leadership or a closely related field. So that could be at the master's level, their educational specialist degrees. It could be an APD or another kind of doctoral degree. And you have to have some teaching experience. So those three components are usually characteristic of almost all licensure systems. But many states also require other steps, one of which might be the one I'm going to talk about here, which is the passage of a licensure examination. So in fact, 32 states require prospective school administrators, principals, and assistant principals to take some kind of exam and meet a pre-decided cut score on that exam as a condition of obtaining a license to become a school administrator. So those licensure exams are they're designed to test whether or not the person entering the leadership field has the necessary competencies to be successful. And so you could think from more of a theoretical point of view that those licensure exams might serve two different potential functions. And we think about, these are the same functions that people think about in terms of teacher licensure as well. We think about exams like praxis, right? Teachers have to take, often have to take praxis or praxis style exams in order to be licensed to teach. It's similar here. So we can think about a screening function. So the idea here is that there's a screen set up and we're only going to allow the people with sufficient capacity to pass through the screen and become eligible to be hired. If you don't pass through the screen, then you're not eligible, so it serves a weeding out function. So if we can set a minimum cut score and we can say, well, that cut score represents the minimal amount of knowledge and skills that the principal, that prospective principal needs to have in order to go into school administration. So that's what we might think of as a screening function. The other you might think of as a signaling function. So among the people who pass through the screen, so among the passers, those scores might indicate something about future job performance. And if that was the case, that would be really nice, because then you could look at the people who score very well on the licensure exam, and you could say, well, maybe we could target something towards those people. Maybe we could pay them more, or maybe we could try to ensure that those are the people that get into schools with large marginalized populations. Like, this is going to be a good leader. Let's put that person in the schools that need them most. All right. So we could think about those two potential functions, and we're gonna look at those two potential functions for this particular exam here in just a minute. But you might also, that sounds great, right? We would like to have an exam that could tell us if someone's going to be, a sufficient leader and/or kind of a high-performing leader once they move into the job. But you might also worry that there could be some downsides. And in particular, you might worry that the exam does something to your candidate pool. So the things that we've worried about with teacher licensure exams and these kinds of standardized exams in other professions is that the scores or the passage rates might really they might vary by characteristics that we care about. And the ones that come up most often are race and gender. Okay, so we might worry that so we've seen, for example, that the reason this matters a lot for school leadership is that we've worried a lot in educational administration and leadership in the past about the underrepresentation of both non-white school leaders and women in the principalship. And so we might worry that if the exam has disproportionate, say, passage rates by those characteristics, that it might be, it's affecting the candidate pool and might make it harder to meet the objective of having a more diverse leadership pool. And that diversity we know matters because there's lots of accumulating evidence that leadership diversity also has impacts on teacher outcomes, student outcomes, characteristics of climate, and so forth. All right, so there could be positives of this exam, there could be negatives of this exam, and kind of the point of this analysis that we're doing is that we're using these kinds of exams in 32 states, but we don't know very much about them. They've been studied almost none. We don't know how they're affecting the pool for potential leaders, and we don't know whether they're actually predicting outcomes that we care about. In other words, whether or not they're actually telling us something about either minimum competency for leadership or effective leadership. So that's what we want to shed, hopefully, a little bit of light on here.
How many of the 32 states are using the SLLA?
Almost 20. I'll show you that in just a second.
Oh, okay.
So it's the most widely used of the exams, but it's not the only one that's used. That's right. Hey, it's on this slide. All right. So the SLLA, the School Leaders Licensure Assessment, is the most common of the exams. It's administered by the Educational Testing Service. So it's required in 17 states plus DC, and then 2 territories, and it costs $425 for a person to take it. So it's not chump change, right? You can take it in most, I think probably in every state. You can take this test until you meet the cut score for licensure in that particular state, but it'll cost you $425 each time you do it. $425, by the way, is about 1% of the average teacher's salary. It's not zero. If I told you I would give you all $425 right now, you'd like that, right? But it's not necessarily a huge barrier, but it's not a zero barrier, in other words, potentially to the retaking. So ETS, this is from ETS's website, says that the test is designed to, quote, measure whether entry-level education leaders have the standards, relevant knowledge, believed necessary for competent professional practice. And it's based on what are called the ISLIC standards. So ISLIC is the Interstate School Leaders Licensure Consortium, and that is the field's way of trying to define what strong school leadership looks like. Okay, so the ISLIC standards, they define school leadership on a bunch of different dimensions, and this exam is essentially a test that's pegged to those leadership standards. So it's not made up out of thin air, in other words. They are based on kind of the field's agreement of what strong school leadership would look like. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about what that looks like, and then I'll tell you what the specific questions are that we're going to ask here. So the SLLA in the current version is a 4-hour computer-based exam. It has 2 sections, and they cover 6 of the ISLIC domains. And there are 100 multiple choice questions plus 7 constructed response items. All right. And I'll actually show you an example on the next slide of what those look like so you can get a little bit of the intuition. But you can see, again, I pulled this off of the ETS website, but you can get a sense here of what those domains are and what the content that's tested on this test are, together with the weight. So these are the multiple choice questions: test vision and goals, teaching and learning, managing organizational systems and safety, collaborating with key stakeholders, and ethics and integrity. And you can see there's a little more weight given to teaching and learning, but they're roughly similarly weighted across. And then section 2, which is the constructed response items, have a couple of questions, which is about 10% of the total on the education system, 2 questions on vision and goals, and 3 on teaching and learning. And so it gives you a little sense of what the scope is. I mean, the scope is broad because school leadership is a complex kind of endeavor, right? So it's testing a broad set of competencies. And what it does is it reduces, based on those scores, it reduces, based on answers, it reduces that to a score between 100 and 200. 163 is ETS's recommended passing score on the exam. And the state qualifying scores range from 160 in Tennessee and Kentucky to 169 is the highest in the nation in Mississippi. Nice for me that 160 is, I'm going to be using data from Tennessee. Tennessee has the lowest cut score in the country. So Tennessee is not going to be weeding out very many people, which is going to be useful for me in an estimation strategy here in just a few minutes. Yeah, Vivian.
Do states change their cut scores based on based on demand needs or anything?
They could in theory, but they don't typically move their cut scores very often. But it's possible, and in fact, one of the reasons I got interested in this question is because Tennessee, which has the lowest cut score in the country, was talking about raising their cut score. And although my sense, I mean, I wasn't involved in the conversations, but my sense of why they were talking about raising it was not necessarily for supply and demand kinds of reasons, but was they were more interested in what it signaled about the esteem that leadership was held. In Tennessee, that the system was signaling that it didn't value leadership because its cut score was so low, and they were considering at least raising it in response to that. So just to show you what a couple of the example questions, this one, and I pulled these off of the practice questions on the website just to give you a sense of what they're asking. So the one on this side is an example of a multiple choice question, and this is an example of one of a constructed response. I'll let you read the one on the right, the constructed response, but I'll read you this one just in case it's hard to see. So a group of high school English teachers have approached the newly appointed department chair with concerns about the existing curriculum. The teachers explained that the curriculum has not been revised in nearly 10 years and is out of date. In response to the teachers' concerns, the department chair should first, A, review the research on exemplary high school English programs, B, convene a meeting with the parent, superintendent, and Board of Education to gather their input, C, collaborate with the teachers to examine the alignment between the existing curriculum and state standards, or D, immediately begin to analyze the curriculum and observe classroom instruction. And I pulled this as an example because that's kind of hard, I think. I mean, I studied this and I kind of puzzled. I mean, the answer is C, but it wasn't totally. That's in the answer key. I looked at this and I thought, well, that is not obvious to me, right? Like this is not an easy test, is my point. And the idea is you need to be you need to have been trained in the ways of ISLIC, right? You need to have learned the standards, and you need to have learned to think from the point of view of those standards in order to be able to answer this question. And this one over here, this question ends with, it's a little setup, and it ends with identify and describe at least 3 steps the principal can take to gain further support for the program and decrease dissatisfaction levels with this particular program. And so then they write an essay, and then that essay is scored by professional scorers. My point is kind of twofold. One, I think this exam is no walk in the park, and I think it's a pretty well-designed test, right? If I was going to design a test here, I'd ask Educational Testing Service to do it, right? It's a very reputable testing firm, and so I think this is a high-quality kind of exam, at least based on my cursory read of what's going on this slide. It's not obvious to me what the answers are here. I mean, that's actually a legitimate point, right? Because we worry about that a lot with licensure exams, like with teaching. You will hear people say about some teacher licensure exams, they're just a test of whether or not you can fog up a mirror, basically, right? They're very easy. I mean, they're very minimal competency. And in this case, at least, I think it's not obvious that that's what's going on here. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we want to answer basically 3 research questions. So the first of those is a very descriptive one. I want to know how the scores are distributed by characteristics of prospective principals, the schools they work in, and then how those characteristics might predict the probability of failing to meet the cut score in Tennessee. That's the data that we have here. And you might say, well, why do you care about whether or not the schools that the characteristics of the school a person works in, why do you care about whether or not that's predictive of their score? And the reason is that we know a lot from the labor market literature that people are very likely to go and be leaders in the kinds of schools that they work in currently. So if a person is a teacher and they're in an admin prep program and planning to go on to become a principal, they're very likely to go into that same school or a school that's like that one. So if things like free and reduced price lunch are predicting getting lower scores, and that's telling you something potentially about the distribution of leadership quality, the dynamics of leadership quality in the system. The second question is, to what extent do SLLA scores predict labor market outcomes? So to what degree do they predict being hired as a principal or an assistant principal? And then conditional on being hiring, does it tell you anything about principal turnover? And then the third one is the screening and signaling question. So does SLLA failure, meaning failing to meet the cut score, does that actually screen out less effective principals? And then to what degree conditional on passing and becoming a school leader, does your score on that exam signal something about the future job performance of principal candidates? All right, any questions about that? All right. So I think given I think what I just said about, I think this is at least by my estimation, a somewhat difficult exam that's testing from a set of standards that we've agreed on as a field, or sort of the capacities that a person is supposed to have, et cetera, then why might it not predict something about performance? And I think before I show you the results, I think it's useful to think through, well, why might I find the opposite of what I'm expecting to find? I think there's at least 4 reasons that we might expect that we are not able to correlate SLLA scores with future performance measures. So the first one is, well, a possibility is that the SLLA isn't pegged to the right knowledge and skill standards. So maybe it's the case that the ISLIC standards don't accurately describe the knowledge and skills that principals need, right? That's a possibility. That's the ISLIC standards don't define the right set of skills, and so we test against a set of skills that are not relevant to what not relevant for future performance. Okay, so that's a possibility. A second possibility is that the standards might be perfectly good ones, but the test isn't a great one. So it's not a good test of those standards. And actually, there's not very much research that's available about the psychometric properties of the SLLA. You can't find much if you look for those. So that's a possibility. A third one is that the standards are great and the test is a good measure of those, but the knowledge and skills that the SLLA measures, they don't really translate into behaviors. Okay, maybe we're measuring knowledge and skills, but that doesn't really tell you very much about what a person is going to do in the job when they're actually hired as a school leader. In practice, it could be just the connection between skills and knowledge and behaviors is not a very strong one. And then the fourth one that as a researcher I have to take very seriously is that the test may predict job performance very well, okay? But it may not predict measures of job performance very well. In other words, I just might not have very good ways of measuring principal job performance. And so so it could be that the exam predicts very well what a person actually does, but because I don't have good measures of that actual performance, I'm not able to link these two measures together. So I don't have a great strategy for addressing that, except that I've got a handful of outcomes. So basically my strategy here is I'm just going to show you a handful of what I think are plausible outcome measures, plausible measures of principals' performance, and then we're going to see the degree to which the SLLA might predict those or not.
So I think this might fit within one of these ideas that you're proposing here, but what about programs that teach prep programs that teach very strongly to those standards, and so it's like you're getting great performance on the test because they were prepared to do well on that test, but it's not. So I guess the second part of that question is, do you have information about the prep routes for these principals?
I do know which preparation program the person is endorsed by, and so in some of the models I will include that as a predictor. But I think that's possible, right? It's possible that we teach to the test in administrative preparation programs, and so we'd see people getting very high scores, but it not being correlated because, and that does kind of, I mean, I guess that doesn't exactly fit. It fits somewhere in the space between 2 and 3, but that's also a possibility. Yeah, that's also a possibility. Actually, a lot of the prep programs, when you look at the requirements of the preparation programs in Tennessee, several of them condition getting your degree on passing this exam. So that is some suggestion that the programs care about this, as an outcome. That's a good point. Jim?
Jason, so I'm wondering if you could just think a little bit or think out loud a little bit about your number 4. And here I'm sort of wondering, it seems to me that who ought to be defining what good job performance is for a principal? I mean, is this, I guess I'm trying to get a little more specificity around how we would know whether we had good measures about job performance, and rather than just sort of taking this notion that I'll collect a bunch of things and see if they're related.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I think as a research community, we don't have great understanding of this. I'm doing some other work so one of the things we're going to use is administrator evaluation. We're going to use the subjective component of the administrator evaluation system. So what kind of rating did a person get from from the person in the central office who rated them? And in Tennessee, there is a rubric that defines what good leadership practice is supposed to look like. It's based on the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards, and people are rated on that. And that's how the state defines what good leadership is supposed to look like. And so if I was the state, then maybe that would be the only outcome that I'm going to care about here. That is what the state has defined good leadership to look like. In some other work I'm doing, we're trying to sort of get to the other part of your question, which is, well, is that measure a good one? Is that measure an appropriate one to use? But there it's a little bit circular because our strategy in that other analysis is also to kind of see the degree to which it correlates, sort of a predictive validity kind of, concurrent validity kind of point of view, is it correlating with these other things that we think might also be good measures? And I think as a field, we have some tools that we think do better than others as measures of leadership, like the VALED, that are used in some districts. But we need a lot of work in this area. I think different states are all using different kinds of measures, and most of those systems have not been validated in a systematic way, and so we're flying a little bit blind because we don't have a really strong, in my sense, a really strong research base to kind of answer your question with. Any other questions? Okay. So here's the data that we have. We're using data from the state of Tennessee. So I have longitudinal administrative data going back to the 03-04 school year. And this is state administrative data. It looks a lot like the administrative data systems that are available in lots of states now. But we have a lot of information about personnel in the system. So at least going back to 03-04, I know a lot about their job histories and demographics. I know what their degree attainment looks like. And then I know lots of information about the schools that they work in and the characteristics of the students that go to those schools, including testing information for the kids and so forth. And then sort of the linchpin for this paper is I have complete score histories for all Tennessee principal candidates who took the SLLA between 2003 and 2014. So that's close to 8,000 test scores for about 7,600 individuals. So I have the score histories, which means I can see a person failing. I can see each time a person took the test. But you can see, since it's 7,951 from 7,633 people, there are not that many people who are retaking the test, although it happens in a relatively small number of cases. There are 3 different forms of the SLLA over this time period. I'll show you this in just a second. And so in some cases, we're going to look just at one form of the test that was used for the longest period. In some others, we're going to standardize the scores and pool them. Basically, ETS gave us these data. So we requested them via the Tennessee Department of Ed, but we asked ETS, could we have score histories? Actually, the department does not, the department only maintains the score that's associated with licensure. So they only have your score when you passed it, and we wanted to also be able to see what happens when people didn't pass. So ETS provided these to us, and then we matched them to the administrative data files. And the match, we didn't have very much trouble we didn't have too many instances where we were not able to match a particular test score to a person. So this is what the implementation of that looked like over the data stream. So you can see there were 3 different test forms. So that's what's across the columns, and then the academic year is labeled down the rows. And what happened was they had what's called Form 1010. You'll hear me refer to that here a few times. Form 1010 was what was offered between 2003-2004 school year, which was the first year Tennessee required the test. And they used that until about 2009. And then they changed the form. They did a big, they changed the test. Okay, so they created a new form and a new format for the test. I imagine those were probably pegged to the new ISLIC standards at the time. So they changed the format. But it was a paper and pencil test in 1010, and it was a paper and pencil test in 1011 when it moved to the new test form. And then Form 6011 is just the 1011 form, but it became computerized. So it's now a computerized exam. The other thing that happened when the test form changed is that Tennessee changed its passing score. So under the old passing score was 156, and when they changed the format of the exam, they also raised the passing score. So it moved from 156 to 160. And so what you can see is that when the test form changed, the test also got harder. So this is the distribution of test scores between the solid line is Form 1010, the older form. And then the dotted line is Form 1011 and 6011 grouped together in the later period. And what you can see is that that the distribution shifted to the left, right? So people were getting lower scores on average, and also the cut score moved, but you can see there are more people who are falling to the left of the later cut score. So on Form 1010, the mean score was about 175 with a standard deviation of about 9. When they shifted to the newer form of the test, the mean fell to just 170, but the standard deviation also got bigger, so there's a bigger spread of about 10. So the standard deviation overall is about 9.5 over the full data stream. And so what this means is you can see the space between the 156 cut score and the old and where the distributional, there's almost no area here. In fact, is only 1.4%. So the failure rate was just 1.4% prior to 2009, but it jumped to more than 14% with the with the change to the test that happened in 2010. So we've got a lot more people who are failing to obtain Tennessee's cut score in the later period than we had in the earlier period. And in fact, my recollection is that this 1.4% is just 57 tests. So out of thousands. So it was a very small rate here. Oh, sorry.
You're ignoring me, Jason.
Sorry, Luke.
I'll get over it. So can you go back one slide where you have your numbers? I was noticing that the number of test takers seems to drop, especially when they move to electronic version. Is there anything else going on in Tennessee that would discourage people from taking this exam?
So the short answer is I don't know, but I've asked this also. Like I've asked this of people at the department. Maybe I haven't asked the right person yet, but I've asked a couple of people in the Teachers and Leaders Division, do they know why these numbers are changing so much from year to year? I think the best explanation for why there's this big jump in 2009 is that a lot of people were trying to take the old version of the test because that's the one that their prep program had sort of prepared them for, and so they took that in advance, and so then you also see this dip following because there are fewer people to take the new version. But then I don't have a great explanation for why then it doubles in the following year. I don't know of, I mean, in 2011 is the year that we did the big race to the top driven reform effort. Lots of things changed in Tennessee schools in 2011-2012 school year. So that's possible. That's possibly an explanation. But the short answer is I don't really know, and people at the department don't have a great sense either of why the numbers might be moving around so much.
So did people choose in 2012 which test to take, or?
No, it's just that they changed it partway through the year. So if you took it earlier in the year, you were on the paper and pencil version. If you took it later in the year, you took the computerized one. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So what are we going to do? So the methods here are relatively descriptive because we're just trying to say, does this thing predict something about what happens in the future? So for my first question about the distribution, I'm just going to do some fairly straightforward things here. I'm going to look at the distribution of scores. And failure rates by school characteristics and candidate and school characteristics. I'll look at those using some simple t-tests, and I'll run some regressions. Essentially, I'm going to just model the SLA score, or the probability that you fail to meet the cut score, as a function of the characteristics of the candidate, characteristics of the schools, put in some year effects, in some cases some regional effects, or some administrative preparation program effects. You can see there's the candidate characteristics are all sort of the standard things here, and school characteristics as well. So we're going to look at location and, the characteristics of the students that are here, the school size, and so forth. And then we're going to look at the labor market outcomes. That's question 2. So we're just going to run some Cox proportional hazard models here. Basically going to model the time to hire as a function of your score, and condition on those same candidate characteristics and school characteristics. We'll also vary this, so we'll look at time to becoming an assistant principal, time to becoming any kind of administrator. We'll test for possible nonlinearities, and we'll look at test, we'll look at test squared, we'll break the test into different categories. And then for the models of turnover, we'll look very similar. So we'll just say conditional on sort of your clock starts the year you get hired, and we'll just look to the time. We'll look at how long you remain as a principal in that school district, and here we can stratify by district, sort of like district fixed effects in a sense, to kind of get a sense of unobserved district specific factors that might be affecting turnover rates as well. And then so those are fairly straightforward. And then the third part is the screening analysis and the signaling analysis, and this is not quite as straightforward. So I'm going to talk through this in a little more depth. So for question 3, so the screening analysis, the basic form of the screening analysis is this. So we're going to put some outcomes, which I haven't told you yet, but Y is an outcome. And we're basically going to say the probability, we're going to say that outcome is a function of whether or not you pass the test. All right, and that's going to be, and also, controlling for characteristics of the school that you work in, characteristics of the district that you work in, this is region, and so forth. And so your first thought should be, well, you don't observe performance for failures, so why is, how are you estimating anything? And that's right. We don't observe someone's outcomes as a principal if they fail, because clearly they failed. They were never licensed to be a principal. And so we're gonna take a different strategy, and I will try to convince you that this is valid, but certainly this is not perfect. There are going to be some problems with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially we're going to simulate passing. So we're going to look at just the pre-2009 period. So for this analysis, we're only going to look at Form 1010. All right, but this is the form that in Tennessee, basically no one failed. All right, so there were 57 failing tests when people were taking 1010 because Tennessee has set such a low cut score. All right, and so and the cut scores are arbitrary. So what we're basically going to the thinking here is, okay, the cut score is arbitrary. Very few people failed. So let's pretend we're not in Tennessee. All right, let's pretend we're in another state. All right, so. Well, first we can pretend we're in Tennessee, so we can, which we are, all right? So we can say, well, we'll make pass an indicator variable for the people who passed at 156 but would have failed at the new cut score that Tennessee set when they signed on to the new test. Okay, or we could say, well, we'll call a person failing if they passed at the 156 cutoff, which again is almost everybody, but they would have failed at 163, which is the most common cut score, and it's also the one that ETS recommends. And then third is they passed at 156, but they would have failed at 169, which is the highest cut score that anybody uses that Mississippi employs. All right, and so essentially we're gonna simulate passage and failure, taking advantage of the fact that for almost everybody, there's passage, just because of the particular state context that we're talking about. Now, that does mean we're going to cut off a small number of people that we are not going to observe future outcomes for. So there's a potential for some bias there, obviously. And so, so take those results with a grain of salt. But we're essentially going to say, given the distribution of outcomes for principals in Tennessee, what if the cut score had arbitrarily been was arbitrarily set where it is for some other states? Would you have found evidence then that there was a successful screening function here? Right? For the signaling analysis, we don't, since this is a signal conditional on passage, we don't have to worry about this. And so here we're going to take the same outcome variables, put those on the left-hand side, and we're just going to, essentially regress those on SLLA score, different forms of the score. We're going to use all of this. It doesn't matter here whether or not the results are essentially the same, whether you use the old form of the test or the new, or you combine them. So we're just going to standardize them and pool them across the different forms of the test. But this is essentially the same set of covariates, although we're adding principal characteristics to the signaling analysis. You could run it with them or without. And look for evidence that there's a correlation between, Luke, let me finish my thought, between the SLLA score and the future outcome. Go ahead.
Jason, does some of your outcomes in either of these two analyses require the individual to be hired as a principal?
Yeah, so we're going to look at probability of hire, but then after that, everything's going to be conditional on being hired as an assistant principal or a principal. For most of the analysis, we're just going to be talking about principals, but I'll show you a little bit about assistant principals as well.
And is it a high rate that are hired? I'm just wondering about, you talk here about the selectivity in some of these because you had to pass to be eligible to be hired, but is there another bit of selection that's going to
yes, the answer is yes. So there are, you're going to have people who are going to be licensed and who are going to become principals very quickly. You're going to have a pool of people who become hired as assistant principals and then go on to become principals. You're going to have people who become assistant principals and we never observe them doing anything else. And we're going to have actually a fairly large number of people in Tennessee who are licensed to become administrators, but we never observe them working in administration. So they remain teachers or they leave the system. And so the numbers of people that we're going to actually observe in principal positions is going to be shrunk way down here in just a couple of minutes because of this issue that you're highlighting. Hey, Jim.
So Jason, I had a similar question, and it really gets back to what the labor market for principals looks like. And so my sense is that with teachers, labor markets vary a lot, right? Suburban districts have a really different kind of labor market than lots of urban districts, especially central city urban districts. And so I'm wondering if that's also true with principals, whether in fact it makes sense to try to examine these issues sort of distinctly for those different types of labor markets. Because I think where I was thinking along the lines of Luke was that, the answers to some of these questions might look quite differently, and my confidence in the methods might be quite different depending upon that.
Yeah, so certainly the labor markets for leaders are very localized, so that's definitely true. So we see this in some other analysis that we're doing about principal preparation programs, that there are regionally there are. So if you're in Eastern Tennessee, especially Northeastern Tennessee, you're at East Tennessee State University, because it's closed and there are not a lot of other options, and so that means that institution is serving that particular geographic space disproportionately. So so you might be right. Kind of looking. I mean, it's a little bit hard because there are not that many prep programs. So I think. But certainly we see that some programs place people at higher rates than other programs. So that is true. Any other questions, thoughts? That's a good one. So, okay, so I'll tell you what the job performance measures that we're going to look at here. So the first one we're going to look at is school level value added. So Tennessee's system is an EVOS style model. It's called TVOS, and we're going to use composite measures for the 2013 and 2014 school years. TVOS is the state's official school level value added measure that it uses for accountability purposes. So it's a composite measure that it aggregates across tests and subjects across different grades, and I don't think that school level value added is a good measure of principal performance at all. In fact, I've written about this in other contexts, but it does make up 35% of the principal's evaluation score. So we're going to look at it. So what the state is one of the state's measures of whether or not the principal is doing a good job. So we'll at least look at whether or not TVOS, school level TVOS correlates with SLA scores. As a complement to that, we're also going to run our own student level growth models. So we're going to use the Tennessee Comprehensive Assessment Program. It's called TCAP. We don't have it anymore. We changed to a new testing regime this year, but we had it for the 2007-2008 school year up until the 13-14 school year in these data. And so this will allow us to run essentially, I'll show you in a second, we're going to run these student level models, and we can adjust for a lot of student covariates that we have in the data then. And then we're going to look, so those measures I think are problematic, but we can look at some other things as well. And these I think you could believe in as measures of principal performance potentially a little bit more. So we're going to, the state has, as part of Race to the Top, the state ruled out a statewide evaluation system for both teachers and for principals. It's called TEAM. And so we have, that started in the 11-12 school year. And so I have summative scores for 2012, 2013, and 2014. These are basically Likert ratings on, so we have the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards. This is a rubric that is based on those standards. And the principal supervisor, which in some districts is the superintendent, in some places it's a deputy superintendent, principal supervisor of some type, they give the principal a rating. They might actually rate the principal several times throughout the school year. We're just going to use the summative rating, the one from the end of the school year. And that in Tennessee makes up 50% of the principal's total overall evaluation. So we've shown in some other work that the scores that the supervisor gives on that rubric, even though they're defined using different domains that are similar in spirit to ISLIC, but actually the scores that a principal gets, you can factor analyze them. There's just one factor there. So there's some kind of perceived effectiveness factor that's sort of driving the scores. And your score on the ethics domain looks very similar to your score on personal management or instructional climate and so forth. The form of the team rubric did change a couple of times over these years. And so we're going to do some different things here. We'll look at the years separately. So I'll show you models separately for 2012, 2013, 2014. I'll also standardize them and pool them because we're going to worry about power here a little bit. And then, but I have those for principals, and I also have the principals' ratings of their assistant principals. So that's the only outcome measure that we have for assistant principals, but I'll mention those at the end. We also ran these models for assistant principal performance. The other thing that we have as an outcome is the state there was a statewide leadership, well, it was a statewide climate learning and instructional climate and learning survey that the state did in 2013 called the TEL. It was a low-stakes survey. The state just ran it as a method to try to learn a bit about what was happening in the schools. And we pulled out about 20 questions from that are aimed at gauging the quality of the school's leadership from the teachers' point of view, but also the assistant principals and the principals. So we kind of have self-assessments of principals as well. They only did that in 1 year, but we're gonna factor analyze the teachers' responses, factor analyze the assistant principals' responses, and the principal. There's nothing to factor. Well, I guess factor analyze that as well. And so we have 3 different measures of leadership quality from kind of a low-stakes survey as well that we're going to look at. Vivian.
Are the principal test scores, are they public? Is that public information? Like, do people or do school districts know if what the quality score or the score that these principals receive when they're hiring them, or?
You mean the score they get on the SLLA?
Yeah.
So the answer is generally no. So I've asked people this, you know. So when I go to hire a principal, if I'm in a school district, do I know what their SLLA score is? And the state doesn't distribute them at all. Like they're provided to the state as sort of a check for licensure. And then after that, what I'm told by people who work in licensure there is, well, then it'd have to be reported by the candidate. So I might tell you what my SLLA score is, but I don't think people do that. I mean, I've asked a couple of, just anecdotally, do you know people's SLLA scores? And people generally say they don't, that, it's done for licensure. But that's going to be, well, that actually becomes relevant here in just a second. So a couple of other quick notes. So when we pull the models across years, we're going to include year fixed effects. We're going to cluster standard errors at the school level. When we're just looking at cross-sectional models, we're going to cluster at the district level. We're going to worry about sorting bias. So we're going to worry that, so I showed you the models that I showed you for the screening and signaling. What we're going to do for the screening and signaling models a second ago, they're going to include district characteristics and region fixed effects. There's 8 regions in the state that they sort of approximate regional labor markets. They're the core support regions for the state, what the state considers its regions. So we're going to use district characteristics and region fixed effects, because if we use district fixed effects, we're going to have a power issue. We don't have that many principals. In a lot of the rural districts, we have almost no principals that we're going to have outcomes for. There's not really much to estimate off of. I'm going to show you the results that use district characteristics and region fixed effects, but we can also do this with district fixed effects, and the results are essentially consistent across the approaches, but using district fixed effects helps account a little bit for sorting to environments, because you're going to worry, this is related to the earlier point about certain prep programs funneling principals into certain kinds of districts. So at least that district fixed effects helps account for that, at least partially, that sorting piece. Yeah, Jim.
So Jason, this comment made me think that you're only observing people who took the test during this period you have.
That's
so
right.
People who have become principals relatively recently in
Yes.
that periods, right? And then as a result, that privileges, schools enter your analysis in a privileged way.
That's right.
And it's schools where principals tend to turn over more. I mean, you sort of get, that's another aspect of this selection, I guess?
That is another aspect of selection. So what we're going to do in the main models is we're just going to limit ourselves to people who are entering the principal position, who are in their first 3 years in the principalship. And then as a robustness check, we're going to look at just people who are first years, and then we're going to look at people that we have that we observe at any point. But even so, that's a particular kind of school, because I think the longest principal tenure we observe is like 8 or 9 years. Okay, so schools that have very long-serving principals in their schools, they fall out of this analysis altogether, and we're going to sort of have over-representation of schools that have high principal turnover for sure. That's definitely right. So this is it's unclear the degree to which this generalizes to the broader set of schools in Tennessee. That's right. Okay. So here's what we find. I'll walk through the results for each of the research questions. So the first one is that some kinds of test takers do better on the test on average than others do. And so as an example, men score about 171 on average, women score about 174. Okay, so there is a difference here. women are outperforming men. That's about a third of a standard deviation. But this is kind of, I think, less policy relevant, okay? Because we're not worried about, we're worried about women not having access to the principalship, not men. So the fact that women are doing better doesn't suggest that the test is, you know, the barrier aspect of the test is less concerning for gender. But here is a result that's a lot more concerning, and this is average scores for white test takers and non-white test takers. And when I say non-white test takers in Tennessee, that means that basically means black test takers. There are very few Hispanic, Asian, or other kinds of test takers in Tennessee, say single digits, in fact, over this data stream. So you can see that white test takers on average score about 6 points higher, which is 2/3 of a standard deviation. That's a pretty big gap between white and non-white test takers. And so what this kind of means for failure or passage is that about 93% of white test takers pass the test on the first try, compared to only about 80% of non-white test takers who meet the cut score on the first time they take the test. And since we don't have that much retaking, only 5% of white test takers never pass the test, okay, even with retakes over the data stream, but 16% of non-white test takers we never observe passing the test. So those are pretty big gaps, I think, that we should worry about. So we can also see differences by other characteristics. So younger test takers do a little bit better than older test takers on average. Suburban test takers do a little bit better than urban test takers or rural ones. And school demographics also seem to matter a little bit. So test takers who work in schools with fewer African American students or fewer low-income students, they tend to do better on the SLLA than prospective principals in other schools. And actually, so those are just kind of from the bivariate analysis. But the main results hold also in a regression model. So if I put all of these factors in, including administrative preparation program, indicators and so forth, we still find that the odds of SLLA failure, failing to meet the cut score in Tennessee, the odds are 4 times higher for non-white test takers than they are for white test takers, and that translates to a predicted failure rate of 6% for white test takers, or 18% for non-white test takers. So you can see it's 3 times the difference, which is big. Right.
Do you have any measure of prior educational experience or performance that might allow you to decompose those test differences on gender and race?
We do not. So we don't. I mean, it depends on what you're thinking about in terms of prior performance. I mean, you could think, well, maybe some of this would be explained by performance on prior licensure exams, for example, or other kinds of tests, or maybe other measures of teacher performance. I mean, that presumably in the future, with more data, you would be able to look at whether or not those kinds of predictors might help explain this relationship. But right now, we don't have anything like that that's available. You can just see that the gap is there. I don't quite know where it's coming from. Other questions about that? Okay, so here this kind of moves on to question 2. So whether or not the school leader's licensure assessment predicts hiring, the answer is yeah, it does. So these are the hazard ratios from those Cox models that I was talking about. The first 2 show whether or not the outcome is becoming a principal. In the middle, it's becoming an assistant principal, and the last 2 columns combine it and just say, okay, becoming an assistant principal or a principal. And people are a lot more likely to be hired when they do better on the exam. You can see the even number models are looking for evidence of nonlinearities here. And so scoring very well, so scoring above a 169 on the exam is pretty predictive of getting a leadership job. So either being hired as a principal or being hired as an assistant principal. So it does do a pretty good job of predicting hiring, even though, as I said to Vivian a second ago, I don't think people actually observe the scores, right? They're observing something that the scores are proxying for, right? Your knowledge of the standards that the test is measuring, probably valuable in being hired. But conditional on being hired as a principal, there's not, we don't find evidence that it predicts turnover. So we don't see that the score predicts staying any longer in that school district. And even look at it non-linearly. There's just that's pretty much a 0 correlation there. And so then when we look at the screening and signaling results, so as I said to Jim, we're gonna look, the preferred models here, we're gonna look just at novice principals. And we're gonna look at them for a couple of reasons. Novice principals, we're gonna call them principals in their first through third year, not only because we're talking about a fairly selected group, right, of schools that have had relatively high turnover in order to be in our data at all, but also because you would expect that the SLA is gonna be most predictive of performance early in a person's career, right? It's measuring knowledge and skills that a person is going to have coming in the door, and after they've had on-the-job experience for a certain amount of time, you would expect that experience replaces whatever it is that the test might be measuring. And so we're going to look at this for first through third year principals, and then we're going to look at it just for first year principals, and we're going to look at it for all principals. And it doesn't matter which one of those you do, you get essentially the same thing. So I'll show you the results for first through third. But the punchline here is a little bit of a depressing one, which is that across specifications and dependent variables, we just don't really find much evidence of screening, and we don't really find much evidence of signaling. So the SLA measure, either in the screening models or in the signaling models, isn't statistically significant basically anywhere, and where it is, it's often wrong signed. Often, and there's just not very much. So I can. I made tables that you can't read, but it doesn't matter because there's nothing here to see. So these are for the screening results, where the outcome here is the subjective component of the team, and this is where I think if there was action, it would be here, because the instructional leadership standards for Tennessee are the closest alignment between what the principals are being rated on in terms of job performance and what the SLA is supposed to be measuring. And you can see there's just lots of zeros here. I mean, there's not very much here. I mean, there's, you can see some, do the kind of division here. You can start to see, maybe the oh no, you can't do that here because that's an odds ratio. I mean, there's just not much here. Oh, it's a coefficient, not an odds ratio, but this is the predictor of the team outcome, and there's just not much here at all. It's the same thing for the screening results for TEL and for TVOS. For the TVOS models over here, there is one significant coefficient, at least at the 0.1 level, but it's the wrong sign, and lots of the coefficients are wrong signed. Now, one important thing from both of these, this is the previous slide, you can see that the numbers of observations are sort of small here, right? So we're only talking about 250 schools, 219 schools. We can there definitely is a concern that Jim was highlighting a few minutes ago about what schools we're talking about here. But I think I think there's less of a concern about power, because even if you took these coefficients on their face, a lot of them are not positive. Okay, there's a real kind of mixing of positive and negative coefficients. And this is TCAP growth. And here we've got lots of kids, close to 300,000 test scores that we're estimating these models for. And again, nothing that we can distinguish statistically from zero for any of these cut scores. Yeah, Jim.
So Jason, I'm wondering how you're thinking about the dynamics here, that these are principals either in their first year or early in their careers. You would imagine that at least some of these, if not all these outcome measures, are things that change over time, and that in order to show progress in a school, a principal has to be there for a period of time to be able to move it in the direction that it needs to go. And so I'm just wondering a little bit about lagged effects or things of that sort.
So I would definitely worry about that for test score growth. I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't think test scores are a very good measure, because I think we don't know very much about the timing of leadership effects. And certainly you could imagine that it takes 3 or 4 years for a principal to be in a school before you start to see an impact on student outcomes. I think it's harder to tell a story if you believe that the rater in that school district is able to observe the dimensions of high quality leadership. I mean, we could certainly worry about that, right? Those observers are not in the buildings very often, and who knows how, they may not be trained especially well to use the rubric, etc. But I have that concern maybe a little less for this as an outcome, and this is the one where I really thought there would be more to it. That I thought there would be more evidence of a correlation between the SLA and the team. But maybe if you, I mean, we haven't done this, so maybe we could kind of look at whether or not there are, we've looked at first through third relative to first, but we could look at first, second, third, fourth, look on out and see whether or not we see differences by experience level. That would certainly be a hypothesis that I would be on board with. Yeah, Vivian.
Can you help us interpret, so what's the difference between 160, 163, 169? So like what's the percentile differences between, like how different are these groups of teachers going to be by sort of simulating differences in cutoffs?
In other words, how hard is it to get over 160 versus to get over 169? It's a good question. So something like 4% of test scores are between 156 and 160. So that's not, I mean, that's almost everybody's getting over that. 169 is, I want to say, like, I shouldn't guess. It's in the, I think it's in the 20 to 30% range. I should know that off the top of my head, and I don't. So these are still low-ish cut scores. Yeah.
Jason, I think this is the outcome that I had wondered what the distribution of it is. Is this the subjective outcome?
This is the subjective outcome.
So I'm just wondering, what sort of distribution does that have? Is it something like we see in some state teachers
Yes.
where everybody's really high, and so maybe the reason why there's no relationship is there isn't much variation to explain in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't that there's no variation, but the variation is very constrained. That's definitely true. So if you look at the distribution, so people are rated, 1 to 5. Almost no one is utilizing 1 to 2, and all the variation is between 3 and 5. But not everybody's getting a 5. So there is more variation between 3 and 5, say, relative to what we often see with teaching. But there's not. But definitely it's the case that the variation is constrained. That said, when we look at this, in the other paper, one of the other papers that we're sort of looking at the predictive power of these of supervisor ratings, we do see that they correlate with some of these other things that we care about. So they correlate with test score growth, and they correlate with the TEL measures and so forth. So they just don't correlate with the SLA score. But that's a great question. Any others? So the signaling results are similar. That we don't see evidence that the score, conditional on coming into school leadership, we don't see a relationship. We don't see a statistically meaningful relationship between the SLA score and any of these outcomes. Higher people who score better on the SLA don't get higher team scores. They don't get higher TVOS or TCAP scores, and they don't get higher subjective ratings from their teachers in their schools, from the APs in their schools, or even from themselves. Those are all those are standardized measures. So those are all really close to 0 as well. And like I said before, we can look at first-year principals, we can look at all principals, we can look at principals with no AP experience, and you get the same thing. We look for nonlinearities. There just really isn't. It's just not there. They're just. We're not finding. I really thought we would, and we're just not finding evidence that the score correlates with these future outcomes. But there is one kind of bright spot, and that is when we look at assistant principals, we do find we only have one outcome measure, so we only have the team rating here, and that's the team rating that's assigned by the principal. And in this case, we do find some evidence that SLA score predicts AP's team ratings in some years, but not all years. So I didn't make a table out of this, but in the screening models, for all 3 of the cutoffs are statistically positive in 2012. The 160 cutoff is significant and positive in 2014. So there's some evidence that the SLA is potentially serving the screening function with respect to this outcome. The signaling coefficients are also positive in 2 of the years and in the pooled models. So again, that's some suggestion that for early career assistant principals, that the SLA score does predict whether or not they're rated highly on their performance by their principals. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Definitely.
You mentioned looking at non-linearities, and I didn't know if you specifically had looked at, like, what if the cut points have been much, much higher? Like, you know, at the higher tail of the distribution, do the patterns look differently? Like if we just hired way better?
Like set it at 185 or
Yeah,
something.
exactly.
No, the answer is no. I mean, we stopped at 169 because that's the highest one that's in practice, but maybe that's too
Sort of
narrow,
what would we
right?
do if we-
Yeah. No, we could do that. And we did run some models at one point where we were looking at quartiles, and like, you know, quartile 4, the cutoff is something like 183 or 184. We didn't see anything there either, but maybe, I mean, maybe the top 25% is even too restrictive. I mean, I don't know. You know, we're sort of feeling it out because we don't have a lot of guidance here. Okay, so a kind of recap here. I do have one more little thing to show you, but so we find that the SLA is positively related to probability of being hired, but we don't find evidence here really of that it screens low performers or that it signals very much about future performance among the people who get hired into principal jobs. I think we should worry about measurement error in the performance measures. I mean, I'm showing you what I have access to, but I'm not going to in any way argue that those are great measures of principal performance, although they are. I think that doesn't, I don't think that undercuts the policy relevance here too much. The state certainly cares about, cares about the evaluation ratings and the student test score based measures, but I think that is a problem from a research point of view. There is some evidence that the exam is more predictive potentially for assistant principals, even though it doesn't have much predictive power for principal performance. But it does seem to be a bigger barrier to entry into the leadership market for some kinds of test takers than others, and in particular, it looks to be a bigger barrier for men. And also for non-white principal aspirants. So I told you the predicted failure rates are about 3 times higher. And so then the question from I think for the Tennessee Department of Ed or for another state that's thinking about moving the cut score, okay, so as Daphne suggested, maybe it's the case that the cut scores are just way too low. I mean, it could be the case that if we could move it to 185 and maybe that would actually tell us something, but there's a big problem if you do that, and I'll kind of illustrate that for you. So this is I showed you this graphic earlier. I've just put some different cut scores on it. So under the current regime where the cut score in Tennessee is 160, so what we've got here is the dark line is our scores for non-white test takers, and the dotted line are scores for white test takers. And then what we've put here, the cut scores, the current cut score is 160 in Tennessee, and then to the right, the cut score in Arkansas and Missouri, which is 163. Both those states, are bordering Tennessee, so is Mississippi. So they have a cut score of 169. So under the current regime, there's a 14% failure rate on the exam, but that's only 11% for white test takers, and it's 29% for non-white test takers. So what if we moved, let's pretend every state has the distribution of scores that Tennessee has, then what would be the implications of raising the cut score? Well, if you raise the cut score to 163, if you raise it to what Arkansas and Missouri has, then the overall failure rate would go up. It would be 21%, but that would only be 15% for white test takers given this distribution, and it would be 39% for non-white test takers. All right, and so suppose you instead raised the cut score to Mississippi, which notice that the peak of the distribution of the non-white test takers for Mississippi is to the left of the cut score. So if you raise it to 169, the failure rate would become 40%. So it'd be a very different pool, but that would only be 33% among white test takers, and it would be 65% among non-white test takers. So you could move it to 169 as Mississippi has done, but you'd be weeding out close to about 2/3 of your non-white principal candidates if we can assume that the underlying distribution of scores in Mississippi looks like the distribution in Tennessee. So I think that's a problem, right? So I think we should be really concerned about what implications the use of the test has for the candidate pool in these states. Given that it's unclear in a sense whether or not conditioning on licensure has a big payoff in terms of performance, right? So Okay, so that's essentially what the first bullet says. The second one here just sort of underscores this point I just made, which is that I think usage of the SLA. I don't think we've I don't think we've said the final word here in whether or not the SLA has value in terms of its ability to predict outcomes. But I really thought there would be more here. Like I should have said this at the beginning, but one of the reasons I went into this project is I do so much work on leadership effectiveness. I thought, well, wouldn't it be really great if we just had like a nice, a shortcut score that I could say, well, low SLA, people who score low on this exam, they don't do a great job, and people who score very high, they do a great job, and that will make a lot of my other work so much easier, right? As we're kind of mucking around and trying to find measures of leadership quality. But that's unfortunately not where I landed here, and so it's the kind of continued use of the test. I think so sort of what I started to say is that my recommendation about what the screening value and the signaling value, we're not finding the evidence that I thought we would expect that I would expect to find, but I don't think we've totally answered this question. I think there are other outcomes you could look at potentially with different data, but I do feel really confident in saying that use of the exam does not appear to be, let's say, even stronger. I'll equivocate only a little bit less. But that if we have a goal of leadership diversity in Tennessee or in other states, I think we have to look really hard at what this test potentially is doing to our ability to meet that goal. In Tennessee, we have a principal workforce that's 82% white, and there are lots of folks who are questioning that number and whether or not that number should be a lot lower given the changing demographics of kids in the state of Tennessee. And it's not clear that use of the SLA is helping advance that goal of diversifying the principalship. So we're not finding a lot of evidence of consistent associations here, and you've all started highlighting, I think, some of the reasons that we might not. I think those reasons are actually interesting, open up interesting avenues, I think, for trying to pursue this a little more and try to understand, well, why is it that we're not finding that the SLA, this licensure exam that people are taking often just before they're becoming principals, is not predicting something about their subjective ratings, for example. I think we've generated a lot of hypotheses here, but I don't think we've settled that question by any measure. That was the last slide. Yeah. Okay, so happy to take lots of comments now. Yeah, Craig.
Thanks so far. In terms of the diversity goal, I may have missed this, but among those who passed the test, is there any diversity difference between the hiring decisions for whites and non-whites?
Non-whites are hired at higher rates than whites are.
Conditional on passing.
Sorry? Conditional on passing. Conditional on passing, that's right. You are more likely to be hired as a non-white candidate. Yes. But I don't know exactly how the percentages break down. Michelle.
First of all, I'm really glad to see you doing this work. I think it's been at least 9 or 10 years since I've seen anybody take a look at the SLLA, so it's nice to have somebody looking at the predictive. My question is, I guess it's more that you're raising a lot of questions for more questions obviously than you're able to answer. And one of my questions is the team aligned to ISLIC as well?
Well, team is aligned. Well, team comes from the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards. Mm-hmm. I think TILS is aligned, but I don't know how closely it's aligned. Yeah.
Because it strikes me that ISLIC didn't change very much in 2008. So if you've got since 1996 ISLIC standards kind of driving what it is that people think is effective leadership, then it's very likely that when people are doing their hiring, they've got that notion in their mind. Mm-hmm. So it makes me wonder if what schools need is ISLIC developed leaders. And obviously we're in the midst of a huge overhaul of the standards. But I think it's worth raising some pretty significant policy questions around whether or not, if you're starting from the research that we have, you're already looking in a rearview mirror.
That's right.
Obviously, in terms of what practice should be like. So, could SLLA actually be predictive of effective leadership in today's schools if it's based on a set of standards that were developed in 1996, given a little bit of a cleanup in 2008? I think that's a huge question, because that may have something to do with, yes, these folks get into their positions because that's how they're being hired, because people think that that's really what effectiveness looks like. But then when we get into the schools that have obviously very ungeneric needs in terms of leadership, maybe the APs are doing well because their positions are much more circumscribed and aligned to ISLIC, whereas the principal's daily life is pretty different.
That's right.
So it's more of a comment.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of that is right. And who knows what'll happen. I mean, presumably, the SLA will be adjusted in response to the newer version of the ISLIC standards, and it's possible that the evolution of the standards matters, and so the test could become more predictive is also a possibility. I don't know. I think those points are right, though.
The new performance assessments, like for example, Massachusetts PAL, can you use those types of data in a similar type of analysis?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine that in that regard, you're looking less at knowledge and skills and more at behaviors. So that might also
That's right.
kind of
Get you closer to performance. Yeah, I mean, certainly a possibility here is that knowledge and skills is just too far away. That it doesn't say enough about how people engage day to day in the leadership of their schools.
Really enjoyed this. Thanks so much.
Do you have any thoughts on what's going on during the hiring process if these scores do predict hiring, but not necessarily job performance? That seems like a problem with the hiring that we're doing for the principals.
Well, I don't know, but I'll tell you kind of my best thinking about this is that I think in a lot of districts, principal hiring is not very formalized, and it's not necessarily very evidence driven. I think when school districts are hiring principals, they're doing it largely on the basis of an interview. And I think it's probably helpful in an interview with the central office, or going through even a formalized interview process where you might be evaluated by multiple constituencies. I think it's really probably valuable to be able to talk in a smart way about the kinds of things that ISLIC measures. And I don't, so I think when people are being hired, I think the central office people who are doing that hiring are probably trying to do the best they can by, saying, well, tell me about what are your thoughts about instructional leadership? Well, your best thoughts about instructional leadership are probably going to be the way ISLIC talks about them, because that's where the ISLIC standards came from, right? So I think people are taking that as a signal of what your likely future performance is. It just turns out, at least if you believe these results, that it doesn't do a very good job of predicting what that performance is. But what we should do about principal hiring and the changes that we should make to that as a field, we could talk about all day, because there's lots of things that I think we could do to hire principals better. But I think that's probably what the explanation here is, that what the score is proxying for something that the districts are actually valuing. It's just that thing just doesn't seem to necessarily translate to performance.
So I'm wondering, is there some sort of multicultural association in leadership that has analyzed the SLLA and kind of given commentary on the degree to which the skills it's assessing are kind of culturally privileging one cultural group or one kind of way of thinking about leadership? Because when I saw those test questions, to me, I'm thinking, like, first of all, they're pretty subjective and you could answer them a lot of different ways, and that people from different kinds of cultural backgrounds or different kinds of leadership styles might respond in ways that work well in their context, but might not be the right answer. So I'm wondering, I don't know leadership at all, but has there been that kind of critique of the standards or the test?
Not that I know, but Michelle might know.
Of the standards, yes, not of the.
Of the test. Yeah. Good question.
Having it's blinking. It's dying.
Okay.
Talk every other word. Having talked recently with a bunch of districts about preparing principals, I was struck by how much they keep a read on who's coming through the ranks and really sort of a preference for hiring from within whenever possible. So I'm wondering if people getting hired actually, just getting the SLLA score is really about the license, and that's just like the most bare minimum, and really people are getting hired. I guess my question is, do you know anything about, are they getting in the hired in districts in which they worked?
Systematically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the market's very localized, so you're very likely to work in the district that you were groomed in, or maybe one of the neighboring ones.
Yeah.
But similar to teachers, when people have sort of looked at the labor market for school leaders, they tend to find that it's a little bit bigger than the market for teachers, but it's not a lot bigger. And so there is definitely, this kind of issue of pipelines, I think actually that's a whole other area that people haven't been looking at enough that we should try to understand better about, what's the relationship between what people are doing when they're teachers or have other kinds of school personnel positions, and then they have to get an administrative credential if they want to be a school leader. And so, some districts are partnering formally with preparation programs, but others are not. And understanding what's the relationship between current place and where you go for your preparation and how you come back, and whether that varies across different kinds of contexts and so forth is something we don't know a ton about. But it's definitely the case that people are the best predictor of where you're going to work is where did you teach. So that's definitely true.
That's right. So I wanted to build on this comment. I mean, if you look at the teacher literature much, you sort of came to the conclusion a long time ago, right, that the praxis exam didn't predict future performance. And there was this real pessimism that it was doing nothing other than screening out people who we might want to enter teaching. And so the notion that you might give a paper and pencil test to principals that would be more predictive, maybe that could occur. But where the teacher literature has gone with this is to observe much more of the kinds of things that teachers do on the job, right? And so it's led to teacher residency programs. It's led to a bunch of other things where teachers are much more engaged pre-service before they become the teacher of record. Well, principals sort of have the potential for this being built in, right? I mean, and it gets back to the comment that I think Sarah was making, that I would presume, this is not my area, but that in high-functioning school districts, that these are things where we're observing people who might demonstrate the skills because they're a department chair or they're a grade coordinator or whatever, and they're demonstrating these skills that we believe, but maybe without much evidence, leads them to become more effective. So these are the people that are encouraged to pursue leadership in this internal market, which may get us back to some of the racial discrepancies that we're observing. But in the end, if we do that well, that might be a much more effective way of trying to have people who ultimately become more effective than some pre-service sort of paper and pencil test that tries to elicit those skills, I guess, is where I'm going. And I didn't know whether, again, I don't spend much time at all in the leadership area, but wondering whether you think there are enough similarities that we should be skipping ahead past these kinds of screening devices and move right much more to practice-based kinds of measures.
I mean, I think so. So here's sort of my take on this. I think teaching is very complex, a very complex endeavor, and yet it at least takes place in a classroom with a set of kids, right, day to day, and think about where we are in terms of the technology of learning what makes a good teacher, right, and then think about what we know about what makes a good leader and the complexity of leadership and what it means to run a school building and how much that can vary from context to context, so maybe, even though I started out saying what I said a few minutes ago, I had high hopes that this test would be something that was predictive. I mean, maybe we need to, maybe moving on, as you said, to some other kind of model. Maybe maybe it's silly to expect that an exam could say something given the complexity of the job. I don't know, but in a way, I think it is built in to think about, at least in a lot of schools, to think about an assistant principal as like an apprenticeship model, right? I think in our data, something like half of principals were assistant principals as their most recent job. So lots of assistant principals sort of have a little internship that varies in length of service, and they get some oversight. And I think there are lots of principals who think of their job as grooming their assistant principals, that being an important part of what they do. But I don't think we have that institutionalized very well. That's not very systematic. That's often idiosyncratic to the individual person. And you could expand it beyond assistant principals, as you were saying, teacher leadership positions, instructional coaches. I think taking, as a field, a wider view of the pipeline into leadership is probably a smart thing to do. And it's not that those conversations are not happening. I think lots of places are trying to think about that in a creative way, but I think it's not as robust as it could be. Any other questions?
Just like one more question, kind of.
Yeah.
On your last bullet point here for the, as we're just kind of throwing out hypotheses.
Sure.
Do you have information about the date at which principals are hired into their position? So I'm kind of also building off of Jim's idea of the experience of the principal and some of the work on teacher labor markets. But when you're hired in August, September, as the school year is starting and you're not really being set up for success, as opposed to a very intentional hire, something else that might just help you pull apart.
Yeah, no, that's a good thought. No, I mean, especially those of you who are graduate students and you're thinking about, what you could work on as graduate students. I think it is not an unproductive thought experiment to close your eyes and think about what have we learned about teachers in the last 5 to 10 years, and then think, do I know that thing about leaders? And the answer will be no. And then you can and then you can think about how you can I think we're learning a lot, right, about late teacher. We know a lot about late teacher hiring, et cetera. And there are lots of those kinds of things about school leadership that I think we're getting to the point now where we have lots of states have the data to be able to kind of dig into those kinds of questions things that we have. We know a lot about from teacher policy and study of teachers over the last 15 years, and we're just starting to do some of that work. Not just, but the kind of robust literature that we have for teachers and teacher quality, we do not have for leaders. It's a great thought.
Is anyone else doing any research with some of the other measures that are getting used? You mentioned there were some others besides SLLA.
Other kinds of quality measures, you mean?
Licensure measures.
Oh, licensure. I don't. Probably yes, and I don't know for sure. I mean, there have been. This is not the first paper to kind of look at the SLA. As Michelle mentioned, their first one that's I think recent. But I think people are interested in some of the other licensure exams that states have developed and so forth. But there's not much here. Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.